the noble, who wanted applause. The grand hall of the Imperial Academy was filled with bright light and quiet tension. Tall silver pillars reached toward a glass ceiling where stars shimmered above. Floating banners showed the symbol of the royal house, and rows of alien nobles sat in curved seats facing a raised stage. Today was not an ordinary day. It was the first public address of Prince Kael'thor, the 19-year-old heir of one of the most powerful houses in the Empire. The Kael'thor stood behind a polished black podium. His armor was new and flawless, lined with glowing blue energy veins that showed his rank and noble bloodline. His movements were confident, almost dramatic. He had spent his entire life surrounded by respect. Teachers praised him, soldiers saluted him. Servants stepped aside the moment he entered a room. This speech was meant to prove he was ready for leadership. Among the many diplomats and observers seated in the hall was a single human representative. He wore no glowing armor, no heavy insignia. His uniform was simple and dark gray, marked only with a small Earth emblem on his chest. His name was Commander Daniel Hayes. He sat quietly in the third row, hands resting calmly on his knees. Kael'thor began speaking with strong energy. He talked about the Empire's strength, about military victories and economic growth. The crowd listened with approval. And then his tone shifted slightly. "The galaxy," the young noble said loudly, "is filled with species that survive only because we allow them to." His eyes moved across the hall, searching for reactions. Some call themselves resilient. Some call themselves adaptable. A few nobles chuckled. Kael'thor's gaze finally landed on the human. "Take humanity," he continued, smiling faintly. "A short-lived species, physically weaker than most, and dependent on technology and alliances for survival." Soft laughter spread through the room. Commander Hayes did not move. He kept his posture straight and his expression neutral. "They speak proudly of survival," Kael'thor went on. "But survival is not strength. It is luck." The laughter grew louder. One officer leaned toward another and whispered, "The prince enjoys this." Kael'thor stepped down from the stage and walked slowly along the aisle. He wanted to feel the crowd's energy, and he wanted to own the moment. He stopped directly in front of Commander Hayes. The hall quieted slightly. "So tell me, human," Kael'thor said clearly, "what makes your species special?" All eyes turned toward Hayes. The human lifted his head slowly. His face was calm, almost thoughtful. There was no anger in his eyes, no embarrassment. "Time," Hayes answered simply. For a second, the hall remained silent. Then scattered laughter returned. "Time," Kael'thor repeated, amused. "You mean the short time your species survives before being replaced?" More laughter followed. Hayes shook his head slightly. "No," he replied evenly. "We survive long enough to learn." The laughter faded just a little. Kael'thor tilted his head. "Learn what? How to build better weapons?" "How to endure," Hayes said. The prince crossed his arms, smiling confidently. "Every species endures. That is not impressive." Hayes looked up at him steadily. "Not every species expects to fail." That sentence created a small shift in the air. Kael'thor frowned slightly. "Explain." "Humans build systems assuming something will go wrong," Hayes said calmly. "We plan for disaster. We prepare for loss. We assume mistakes will happen." Some of the senior officers in the audience exchanged subtle looks. Kael'thor laughed lightly. "So you admit weakness?" Hayes shook his head. "No. We admit reality." The prince felt irritation rise slightly, and though he hid it behind confidence. "And what has this reality given your people?" Hayes answered without raising his voice. "Continuity." The word settled heavily in the hall. Kael'thor stepped closer. "Continuity?" "Yes," Hayes said. "Empires rise quickly when everything goes well. They fall quickly when it doesn't." The hall became quieter. We assume things will not go well, Hayes continued. That keeps us ready. For the first time, Kael'thor felt the attention shift away from him slightly. Not dramatically, just enough to notice. He straightened his shoulders. Are you suggesting our empire is unprepared? I am suggesting, Hayes replied calmly, that preparation is not always loud. That sentence carried more weight than any insult. Kael'thor forced a smile. You speak confidently for someone surrounded by warriors stronger than you. Hayes nodded once. Strength is relative. The prince leaned closer. Hey, do you believe you could defeat one of us in combat? The room grew tense. Hayes did not hesitate. That depends. On what? Kael'thor asked sharply. On whether you believe this is about winning, Hayes replied. That answer confused the young noble. Hayes continued. Humans do not measure strength by applause. The words struck deeper than Kael'thor expected. The prince stepped back slightly, regaining control of his expression. You speak in riddles. No, Hayes said quietly. I speak in patterns. The silence in the hall was now complete. Kael'thor realized that the laughter had stopped entirely. He had expected humiliation. He had expected anger or defensiveness. Instead, he faced calm certainty. The human had not tried to impress anyone. He had not argued loudly. He had simply stood there and answered honestly. Kael'thor forced a final smile and turned away, signaling the end of the exchange. Nay, we will continue this discussion later, he announced to the hall. But as he walked back toward the stage, he could feel it. The applause that followed his speech was polite, not powerful. And in the third row, Commander Daniel Hayes remained seated, quiet and steady. The young noble had tried to mock him, but something had shifted in the room, and Kael'thor did not yet understand what he had started. The question that changed the room, after the formal address ended, nobles and officers gathered in small circles across the grand hall. Conversations were no longer focused on Prince Kael'thor's speech about imperial strength. Instead, quiet discussions centered around the short exchange between the young noble and the human commander. The word continuity repeated softly among diplomats who understood how powerful that concept truly was. Kael'thor noticed the shift immediately. He had expected praise, admiration, excitement. Instead, he felt analysis. Some senior generals were not laughing anymore. They were thinking. That unsettled him. Determined to regain control of the moment, he announced an open forum session. It was meant to showcase intellectual dominance, a demonstration that the Empire's heir could dismantle any opposing argument publicly. Commander Daniel Hayes remained seated, calm as ever, when attendants invited him to join the central discussion platform. Kael'thor stood tall at the center once again. Let us continue, he said confidently. You claim humanity survives because it expects failure. That sounds like a species built on fear. Hayes stepped onto the platform without hesitation. No, he replied. It is a species built on acceptance. The hall quieted again. Acceptance of what? The prince asked sharply. Acceptance that we are not the strongest, Hayes answered evenly. Not the fastest, not the most advanced. A faint murmur passed through the audience. Then why are you still here? Kael'thor demanded. Because we prepare for that reality, Hayes said. The prince folded his arms. Explain how expecting defeat leads to survival. Hayes looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of several seasoned commanders. When humans build cities, we assume natural disaster is possible. When we design networks, we assume failure is certain. When we explore space, we assume accidents will happen. That is weakness, Kael'thor insisted. But it is planning, Hayes corrected. The prince stepped closer. Planning did not stop your species from nearly destroying itself through war. Hayes did not deny it. Correct. The honest admission surprised the audience. But we learned from it. Hayes continued. Every global war forced structural reform. Every crisis forced scientific advancement. Every mistake forced adaptation. A senior general leaned forward slightly, listening carefully. Calthor tried a different approach. So you claim pain is your advantage? No, Hayes said calmly. Our advantage is that we expect pain. The silence deepened. Hayes continued, his voice steady. Many civilizations expand during stability and collapse during instability. Humans expand cautiously because we assume instability will return. An older academic in the audience nodded subtly. Calthor felt the conversation slipping beyond simple mockery. He needed to regain dominance. You speak of adaptation, he said, raising his voice slightly. Yet your species has a short lifespan. You do not have the centuries of experience we possess. Hayes answered without hesitation. That is precisely why we evolve quickly. Several officers exchanged looks again. A short lifespan forces rapid improvement, Hayes explained. We cannot afford slow correction. The prince frowned. You make fragility sound like strength. Hayes gave a small nod. It is. The word carried quiet confidence. The Calthor turned toward the crowd, searching for support. This is clever language, he said loudly, but strength is proven on the battlefield. Hayes did not argue. Agreed. The simplicity of that response caught the prince off guard. Then tell me, Calthor pressed, why do humans challenge stronger species and still survive? He expected pride or exaggeration. Instead, Hayes answered calmly, because we never expect fairness. The hall grew completely still. We assume disadvantage, Hayes continued. So we prepare alternatives, redundant systems, multiple strategies, flexible doctrine. We do not plan for ideal conditions. We plan for collapse. One of the Imperial strategists leaned toward another and whispered, That explains their decentralized command structure. Calthor noticed the shifting reactions. The crowd was not laughing anymore. They were analyzing humanity seriously. You are saying, the prince said slowly, that humans assume defeat and therefore avoid it? Hayes gave a slight nod. We assume defeat is possible. That keeps us adaptive. The prince realized something uncomfortable. He had grown up in a system where victory was expected, where dominance was assumed. Failure was rarely discussed openly. Weakness was hidden. Humans discussed failure openly. Calthor tried one final challenge. If your species is so prepared, he said firmly, what would you do if this empire decided humanity was a threat? The question felt sharper than the earlier mockery. Hayes did not change expression. We would survive, he said. How? Calthor demanded. By adjusting, Hayes answered. We always do. There was no bravado in his tone, no dramatic threat, only certainty. The room felt heavier than before. Several high-ranking officers were no longer observing the prince. They were studying the human. Calthor sensed it clearly now. And the shift he felt earlier had grown stronger. Authority was no longer measured by volume in the room. It was measured by weight of words. The prince stepped back slightly. You speak with confidence for someone from a younger species. Hayes met his gaze. Confidence does not require age. The statement carried quiet finality. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Hayes added one final sentence, softly but clearly enough for the hall to hear. We do not survive because we are stronger than the galaxy. We survive because we refuse to assume the galaxy will be kind. That line stayed in the air long after he finished speaking. No applause followed. No laughter, only thoughtful silence. And for the first time in his young life, Prince Calthor realized that commanding attention was not the same as earning respect. The challenge he should not have made. The silence in the grand hall did not fade quickly, and Prince Kael'thor felt it pressing against him like invisible weight. He had expected admiration after dismantling a weaker species in public debate. Instead, he felt eyes shifting away from him and toward the human commander standing calmly at the center of the platform. That unsettled him more than open disagreement ever could. He straightened his posture and forced a confident smile. "Words are easy," he declared, raising his voice to reclaim authority. "Philosophy does not win conflicts. Strength does." The statement was familiar and comfortable. It was the language he had been raised with. Commander Hayes did not contradict him. "Strength matters," he agreed. The agreement surprised Kael'thor slightly. He had prepared to counter denial, not alignment. "If strength matters," the prince continued, "then prove yours." A murmur passed through the crowd. This was no longer intellectual debate. The tone had shifted. Hayes remained composed. "Prove what exactly?" "That humans are not merely survivors hiding behind preparation," Kael'thor replied. "Demonstrate your strength." The senior generals began exchanging subtle looks. Some understood what the prince was doing. A public test would redirect attention back to physical dominance, where imperial species held clear biological advantage. Hayes observed the young noble carefully. There was no hatred in his gaze, only evaluation. "You are 19, Hayes said calmly, but the statement caught Kael'thor off guard. "That is irrelevant." "It is relevant," Hayes continued, his tone neither insulting nor dismissive. "You have not yet experienced systemic collapse. You speak confidently because your world has not failed you." The words were not loud, but they carried deeper impact than any accusation. Kael'thor felt irritation rise sharply. "You imply I lack experience?" "I imply," Hayes answered evenly, "that survival experience changes perspective." The prince took a step closer. "And you believe that gives you superiority?" "No," Hayes replied. "It gives us caution." That distinction frustrated the young noble further. He wanted a contest of dominance. Instead, he faced measured responses that turned every challenge into reflection. "You speak as if your species has faced extinction," Kael'thor pressed. Hayes met his gaze without hesitation. "Multiple times." The hall reacted visibly. Several scholars shifted in their seats. "Our climate destabilized," Hayes continued calmly. "We engaged in global wars. We nearly collapsed through technological rebellion. We survived pandemics and resource crises." He did not dramatize the list. He stated it plainly. "And each time," Hayes added, "we believed it might be the end." Kael'thor tried to hold eye contact, but something about the human's certainty unsettled him. And he realized suddenly that he had never imagined his empire failing. The idea was foreign to him. Threats were always external, never internal. "You survived because you were fortunate," Kael'thor said. Hayes shook his head slightly. "No. We survived because we planned for worst-case outcomes. When systems failed, backups existed. When leadership collapsed, alternatives formed. We expect failure. That expectation keeps us adaptable." One of the elder strategists in the audience whispered quietly, "Redundancy doctrine." The prince heard it. He realized the debate had shifted beyond pride into strategy. "If you believe preparation equals strength," Kael'thor said carefully, "then let us test it physically." Gasps spread across parts of the hall. A combat challenge between a noble heir and a foreign military commander was highly unusual in such a formal setting. Hayes did not react emotionally. "This is unnecessary." "That sounds like refusal," Kael'thor replied quickly. Hayes looked at him steadily. "No, it sounds like assessment." The young noble interpreted that as hesitation. You speak of endurance, Kyle Thor pressed, his voice sharper now, yet you hesitate to defend it. Hayes exhaled slowly. Commander to noble combat would prove nothing. It would prove courage, Kyle Thor insisted. The hall's tension grew thicker. The guards adjusted their stances, not in aggression, but readiness. After a brief pause, Hayes spoke again. If I accept, he said, the outcome must remain symbolic. What does that mean? Kyle Thor asked. It means no permanent harm, Hayes answered. No escalation. No wounded pride beyond what this room can hold. The phrasing struck several senior officers deeply. Hayes was already anticipating consequences. Kyle Thor nodded sharply. Agreed. The space at the center of the hall cleared slowly. Attendants lowered defensive shields along the perimeter to contain potential energy discharge. The crowd leaned forward, curiosity replacing earlier mockery. Kyle Thor activated his training blade, a controlled energy weapon designed for non-lethal duels. Its blue edge hummed with restrained power. Hayes removed his uniform jacket calmly and placed it on a nearby chair. Beneath it, and he wore a simple undersuit reinforced lightly at the joints. No visible weapons. You fight without armor? Kyle Thor asked. Yes, Hayes replied. The simplicity of the answer unsettled the prince slightly. You believe that makes you impressive? Kyle Thor said. No, Hayes answered. I believe it reduces excuses. That response drew a faint, surprised reaction from the older generals. Kyle Thor stepped into stance, confident in his physical advantage. His species possessed superior reflex speed and natural strength beyond human baseline. He expected the demonstration to be brief. Hayes stood relaxed, not lowering his guard, but not adopting an aggressive posture either. The hall grew completely silent. In that silence, Prince Kyle Thor finally sensed something he had not expected. This was no longer about proving the human wrong. It was about proving himself right. And for the first time since he began mocking the human earlier that day, an uncertainty crept quietly into his thoughts. The lesson in control. When Prince Kyle Thor rose from the polished floor, the energy blade in his hand flickered once before stabilizing. The hall was no longer filled with arrogance. It was filled with attention. Every noble, officer, and scholar present understood that what they had just witnessed was not humiliation, but precision. Commander Hayes had not struck with anger. He had not displayed overwhelming force. He had simply redirected momentum and controlled outcome. Kyle Thor steadied his breathing. His pride had taken a blow, but not his body. The human had ensured that. That detail mattered more than the fall itself. Hayes stepped back respectfully, giving the young noble space to regain balance. You anticipated my movements, Kyle Thor said, his voice quieter now, less sharp. Yes, Hayes replied calmly. How? The prince asked, frustration mixing with curiosity. Patterns, Hayes answered. You committed fully to strength because you expected it to decide the exchange. Kyle Thor looked down briefly at his weapon, then back at the human. And you expected me to do that? Yes. The directness of the answer held no insult. It carried analysis. The hall remained silent. No one laughed. No one whispered. Even the senior generals were studying the exchange carefully. You said earlier that humans prepare for failure, Kyle Thor said slowly. Did you expect to lose? Hayes gave a faint nod. Always. The answer startled the audience again. You expected defeat? Kyle Thor pressed. I expected the possibility, Hayes clarified. So I prepared alternatives. The prince began to understand the deeper layer of the encounter. Hayes had not entered the duel believing he was superior. He had entered assuming disadvantage and built strategy from there. My species trains for dominance, Kyle Thor said, almost to himself. Mine trains for survival. Hayes replied. The difference echoed more loudly than any applause. One of the elder generals stepped forward slightly. "Commander Hayes," he said carefully, "you did not attempt to strike the prince when he fell." "There was no need," Hayes answered. "Why?" the general asked. "Because the objective was understanding," Hayes replied, "not victory." That sentence carried heavy weight. The duel had not been about proving humans stronger. It had been about demonstrating that strength without understanding collapses quickly. Kael'thor deactivated his blade fully this time and placed it aside. His breathing had slowed. His earlier confidence had transformed into reflection. "You moved only when necessary," he observed. "Yes. You did not attempt to overpower." "No. You waited." Hayes nodded slightly. "Impatience creates openings." The young noble realized something uncomfortable. He had attacked to display superiority. Hayes had responded to manage outcome. There was a difference between seeking applause and seeking resolution. "You could have embarrassed me further," Kael'thor admitted quietly. Hayes shook his head. "That would serve no purpose." The prince finally looked directly into the human's eyes without anger. "I misjudged you." Hayes responded evenly. "Many do." The statement was not bitter. It was simply fact. In the audience, murmurs of thoughtful agreement replaced earlier tension. And senior officers recognized what had just occurred. The duel had been small in physical scale, but large in implication. Humanity did not rely on visible advantage. They relied on layered preparation and disciplined response. Kael'thor took a slow breath and turned toward the crowd. His voice was steadier now, less theatrical. "I sought to mock what I did not understand," he said openly. "I believed composure meant weakness." He paused before continuing. "But today, I learned that composure can be strength." The hall responded not with loud applause, but with respectful nods and quiet acknowledgement. It was a different kind of approval. It carried weight. Commander Hayes stepped back, giving the prince full view of the assembly. He did not seek credit. He did not speak further. After a moment, Kael'thor turned back to him. "If humans expect failure," he said carefully, what do they expect from allies?" "Consistency," Hayes answered without hesitation. "And from rivals?" "Clarity." The prince nodded slowly. "Then you have both." The statement marked a turning point not only for him, but for those who would one day follow his leadership. As the formal session ended, the hall gradually returned to quiet movement. Yet the atmosphere was different. The young noble who had begun the day seeking applause now walked with a different posture, less rigid, more thoughtful. Hayes retrieved his jacket calmly and prepared to leave the platform. Before he stepped away fully, Kael'thor spoke one last time. "Commander," he said, his voice sincere, "what is the greatest strength your species possesses?" Hayes paused briefly before answering. "We learn," he said. Then he walked back toward his seat without further ceremony. In the center of the grand hall, Prince Kael'thor remained standing for a moment longer, replaying every exchange in his mind. And he had tried to mock a human for being weaker. Instead, he had discovered that humanity's strength was not loud, not flashy, and not dependent on dominance. It was built on adaptation, and that kind of strength did not need applause to endure. The shift in perspective. The duel ended without celebration, yet its impact spread faster than any official announcement. Within the Imperial Academy, the recordings of the exchange between Prince Kael'thor and Commander Hayes were reviewed repeatedly by instructors and strategists. It was not analyzed as a defeat of the prince, but as a demonstration of composure under pressure. Senior officers quietly pointed out how the human had moved only when necessary, how he had allowed aggression to expose weakness, and how he had stopped the confrontation the moment understanding was achieved. And these details mattered more than the brief physical imbalance on the platform. Prince Calthor returned to his private chambers later that cycle without the usual entourage. He dismissed his attendants and stood alone before a wall-sized display showing historical battles of the Empire. Victories filled the screen, massive fleets, decisive strikes, planets brought under control. He had grown up believing that these images defined strength. Yet as he studied them now, he noticed a pattern he had once ignored. Every victory shown was followed by a period of consolidation, rebuilding, and adjustment. Even his powerful empire survived, not because it always won instantly, but because it adapted after every conflict. He replayed the duel from memory. Hayes had not shown contempt. He had not celebrated the prince's fall. He had even ensured the blade's angle avoided injury. That was deliberate. The human had demonstrated superiority in control, not aggression. Later that evening, Calthor requested access to deeper intelligence archives on humanity. The data surprised him more than the duel itself. Human civilization had experienced repeated crises: environmental collapse, global wars, technological rebellions, economic failure. Each event came dangerously close to destroying them. Yet instead of collapsing permanently, they reorganized. They built redundancies. They restructured governance. They improved response systems. And Calthor realized something uncomfortable. Humans did not see crisis as exception. They saw it as inevitable. The next day, he requested a private meeting with Commander Hayes before the human delegation departed the academy. They met in a quiet observation chamber overlooking the capital skyline. The tone was no longer competitive. There were no guards positioned aggressively nearby, only distant attendants. Calthor spoke first. You planned for my aggression?" "Yes," Hayes answered calmly. "Even when I mocked you publicly." "Yes. You expected I would challenge you." "It was probable," Hayes replied. The prince leaned slightly forward. "You never reacted emotionally." "No." "Why?" Hayes looked toward the skyline before answering. "Because emotion clouds analysis. When someone seeks dominance through insult, reacting gives them control." Calthor considered that carefully, and he had indeed sought control through public pressure. "I wanted applause," he admitted quietly. Hayes nodded once. "That is natural at your age." The honesty surprised the prince. There was no condescension in the statement. "You are older than me," Calthor said. "Yes." "And you have seen collapse." "Yes." The prince paused before asking the next question. "What is humanity most afraid of?" Hayes did not answer immediately. When he spoke, his tone was steady. Stagnation." Calthor frowned slightly. "Not destruction." "Destruction can be rebuilt from," Hayes replied. "Stagnation cannot." The statement struck deeper than expected. "You believe my empire is stagnant?" the prince asked. "I believe every long-standing power risks it," Hayes said carefully. "Dominance can create comfort. Comfort can reduce preparation." The prince did not feel insulted. He felt challenged. "If we adapt," Calthor asked, "would humans see us as rivals or allies?" Hayes answered without hesitation. "Prepared rivals are respected. Adaptive allies are valued." The clarity of the response removed ambiguity. Calthor straightened slightly. "I underestimated your species." "Yes." "You expected that?" "Yes." The prince allowed a faint smile this time. "You expected me to learn as well." Hayes returned the slight smile. That was the goal. There was no arrogance in his expression, and only satisfaction that the lesson had taken root. When the human delegation prepared to depart later that cycle, the Academy's farewell ceremony was formal but respectful. No mocking words were spoken. No exaggerated praise was offered either. The shift was subtle, yet visible to anyone paying attention. As the human transport lifted into the sky, Calthor stood watching quietly from a balcony. One of his senior generals approached him cautiously. You showed humility today," the general said. "I showed adjustment," Calthor corrected calmly. The general nodded slowly. "That is strength." The prince looked up at the fading transport vessel and spoke softly. "He did not defeat me." "No," the general agreed. "He redirected me." The realization felt clearer now. The duel had never been about physical dominance. It had been about demonstrating a mindset. Humanity survived not because they were always the strongest species in the room, but because they refused to assume the room would remain safe. As Calthor turned back toward the academy halls, he felt different than he had the previous day. He was still confident, still heir to power, but the foundation of that confidence had shifted. It was no longer based solely on inherited strength. It was now rooted in awareness, and that awareness had come from the human he had tried to mock. But the noble who chose to learn months passed after the human delegation departed the Imperial Academy, yet the lesson from that single encounter continued to echo through Prince Calthor's decisions. At 19, he had wanted recognition. He had wanted applause from generals and admiration from nobles. Now, at the same age, he began to understand that authority was not earned through volume or humiliation. It was earned through clarity and preparation. Within the academy, Calthor made subtle but significant changes to training programs. He ordered simulations that introduced unexpected system failures. Fleet commanders were instructed to practice scenarios where communications collapsed. Supply routes were intentionally disrupted in exercises to test adaptability. Some officers resisted at first, arguing that imperial dominance made such scenarios unnecessary. Calthor disagreed calmly. Dominance does not remove uncertainty," he stated during one strategy session. "It only delays it." The influence of Commander Hayes's words became visible in these adjustments. Redundancy plans were strengthened. Contingency protocols were reviewed more seriously. Younger cadets were encouraged to question assumptions rather than rely blindly on inherited systems. Calthor did not publicly credit the human for these reforms, but privately he recognized their origin. News of these strategic shifts reached human space as well. Commander Hayes received a report summarizing changes in Imperial doctrine. His officers expected amusement or pride. Instead, Hayes simply nodded. "Adaptation is contagious," he said quietly. He did not view the Empire's adjustments as victory for humanity. He viewed them as stability for the galaxy. 2 years later, during a joint diplomatic summit between the Empire and several neutral systems, Calthor encountered Commander Hayes again. This time, the atmosphere was different. There was no debate platform, no open challenge, no attempt at humiliation. Both men stood as representatives of mature powers rather than competitors seeking dominance. During a quiet moment between formal meetings, Calthor approached Hayes privately. The prince had grown slightly taller, but more importantly, he carried himself with steady composure rather than theatrical confidence. "I reviewed our first encounter many times," Calthor said calmly. "At first I believed you embarrassed me." Hayes listened without interruption. "Now I understand you prevented something worse," the prince continued. "If I had succeeded in mocking you publicly, I would have strengthened my pride, not my leadership." Hayes gave a faint nod. "Leadership that depends on humiliation is unstable." Calthor allowed himself a small smile. "You expected me to mature?" "I expected possibility," Hayes replied. The prince paused before speaking again. "When I challenged you that day, I wanted the court to see my power." "And what do you want them to see now?" Hayes asked. "Resilience," Calthor answered without hesitation. "Preparedness. Awareness." The human commander studied him for a moment. There was no trace of arrogance in the young noble's tone. Only growth. "That is strength," Hayes said simply. The summit concluded with expanded cooperation agreements. Trade flourished. Joint patrol initiatives strengthened border security. Smaller species benefited from reduced tension between the two larger powers. Stability had become profitable, and profit encouraged continued restraint. Years later, when Thor eventually ascended fully into imperial leadership, his reputation differed sharply from what many expected when he was 19. He was known not for crushing rivals, but for anticipating collapse before it happened. His empire became harder to destabilize because it trained for failure rather than assuming eternal success. In one of his first major addresses as full ruler, Thor spoke openly about resilience. Without naming individuals, he referenced the day he learned that calm composure can carry more power than loud dominance. The audience understood the story even if he did not recount it directly. It had become part of Academy history. Far away, Commander Hayes retired quietly from frontline duty after decades of service. When younger officers asked him about the alien noble who once challenged him publicly, he would answer briefly. He was 19, he would say, and willing to learn. The story spread through both civilizations, not as a tale of humiliation, but as a lesson in growth. A young alien noble tried to mock a human soldier. The human did not shout, did not threaten, did not seek applause. And he responded with patience and preparation. That response changed the noble more effectively than anger ever could. In the end, the galaxy remembered the encounter not because someone won a duel, but because someone adjusted their thinking. Strength had been demonstrated, but not through brute force. It had been shown through restraint, awareness, and the quiet confidence to walk into mockery without losing balance. The 19-year-old alien noble did not expect the human's response. So what he received was not humiliation. It was perspective, and that perspective shaped the future of an empire.